In this video, we're going to talk about some weird hair history facts that I have found, and I don't have anyone to share them with, so I thought I would share them here with you guys. So this is in no way a comprehensive look at all the history of hair, but these are just some figures and some facts from history that I thought you might like to clap your eyes on, because I did, and now I can't unsee them. Now you need to see them too. Let's go back now to ancient Egypt. We're talking 3,000 to 2,300 years BCE, so a long time ago. And I don't know if you knew this, but aristocratic women and men back then did not wear their hair out. They would shave their hair, and they would often wear wigs. Now, women had longer wigs and men had shorter wigs, and that's all cool. So if you look at images from back then, one thing that you'll notice that's kind of interesting is that there are these wax cones on top of people's wigs. What are these wax cones? Well, I'm going to tell you. They think that these wax cones held fragrance, and you would wear this on top of your head, and throughout the evening, this was a status symbol. This would melt into your hair and it would be fragranced, and it would release this beautiful scent the whole evening through. Interestingly, in 2019, they actually found a mummified, preserved body of a woman with this cone intact on top of her head. And so now they're starting to think, if she was buried in it, maybe it actually has a different symbolism or significance of some sort. Maybe it's a talisman of some sort, or maybe it's a status marker of some sort, and maybe it wasn't necessarily perfumed like wax that was going through their wig throughout the night. They don't know though. Right now, they think that the prevailing theory is that it was indeed wax that would melt. Let's move on to ancient Greece now. If you look here, they're not photographs, right? The reason we know what people's hair look like from ancient Greece is because two things have survived. A lot of beautiful statues, and ancient Grecian statues are renowned for their beauty, so we can see their hair. And a fun fact, although we see these statues as white and we perceive them now as being like white marble statues, they were in fact colored at the time. And the dress and clothing, things like that, they would have had colors, and they would have maybe been wearing things in their hair that was also colorful. We know that they loved their ringlets, right? So you're going to see this prevailing style a lot in ancient Grecian pottery and also in the statues. And I want you to look carefully at this hairstyle because it comes back into fashion in a way that you might not expect. So hang on to that mental image. Let's move along now. And I know that this is a very Eurocentric trip through this, but keep in mind, I am still researching other types of hair history. My personal specialty, my degree is in European studies, which is not something I get to use every day, but has come in handy as I sort of research through hair history because I have a lot of familiarity with these eras and stuff like that. We move on from ancient Greece, and then women covered their hair. That was very, very common, like completely. Not a lot of their hair necessarily was visible. Let's move on now then to the early Middle Ages and even the Tudor era. Now, women covered their hair. The mother of Elizabeth the First, the OG Elizabeth, wore something that they called a French hood. So women wore something called hoods. Women that were aristocratic, a woman in the royal court in England would have worn a hood over their hair. They would have worn a middle part, piece of linen on top of that, and then a really elaborate hood, right? As time progressed, the hoods became more elaborate, and Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth's mummy, wore something called a French hood because she grew up actually in France. And a French hood, you can tell what a French hood is because it has a rounded shape on the top. The shape preceding this was called a Gable hood. And I think sometimes they call this an English hood. I'm not a huge expert on Tudor hood styles, but I do know the difference, the basic difference between them, French being rounded and the other one being kind of angular, like a roof, like a gabled roof, basically. After Anne Boleyn got that, we know how that ended. The next wife, Henry VIII's next wife, went back to the Gable style in a sort of FU really to Anne Boleyn, saying like, well, the English style is actually good enough for us, and we don't want those fancy French hoods here. Moving on, Elizabeth the First, the famous redhead. They're still making movies about her. Like every 2 years, there's a new Elizabeth movie. Remember, like the most recent one was Margot Robbie, like uglifying herself basically for this role. But it is true that the sort of shocking bald scene in the most recent Elizabeth movie is actually true. By the 1590s, Queen Elizabeth was wearing auburn wigs. They matched her natural hair color, and it became kind of a trend among the ladies of her court. They too started dyeing their hair auburn or wearing auburn wigs as well. So she kicked off a big redhead trend. Shout out to all the redheads. But interestingly, Elizabeth did not wear a hood. She actually was someone who stopped. She just stopped wearing a hood, going much more for jewels in her hair, and why not? If you look at her clothing, just as a short aside, they are studded with jewels like no other. The level of jewels in her clothing, insane. And also, just on another tangent, no articles of her clothing survive. Isn't that interesting? And that is for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was there was a big fire in England after her death. And another was that textiles and clothing was so valuable that they were very much passed down to people. And you would show favor to someone that you liked by passing down your garments. So nothing of hers is intact, really, except for, I think, one piece of cloth that survives as an altar cloth in a church in England, which I guess makes sense, right? So that's another thing that happened when things got too worn or too dated to wear. They would be turned into household goods, like seat covers for chairs or like pillows. Let's move along now to some other women who are famous for their hair, and that is Marie Antoinette, who wore these very, very tall hairstyles, which she is, I think, really famous for. If you think about her, you probably think of an elaborate white hairdo that's 2 feet high. And the Duchess of Devonshire, a little less well-known historical figure, but actually a friend of Marie Antoinette. These two ladies knew each other and they hung together, and they both had enormous hair. So some interesting things. Marie Antoinette, that would have been her real hair. And back then women didn't wear wigs to get that huge amount of height. They would actually wear something like pads inside their hair, and their hair would be pulled up around. And so if they had long hair, it could go quite high. Does that make sense? And with a lot of powdering, that really thickened it up. And that powder was made from wheat. So they would have used that to really whiten their hair. In France, a much more powdered white look was in. And in England, it was definitely less powdered. But the Duchess of Devonshire as well was known for her super tall hairstyles. And then eventually that kind of fell out and it went more wide, almost like a cloud instead. And so that was a look. That was a look and a half. And if you want to hear more about the Duchess of Devonshire, who is a Spencer, by the way, and that means that Lady Diana, Princess Diana, is a descendant of the Duchess of Devonshire. They are both Spencers. The thing to know about her is that Keira Knightley did one of her famous, period dramas, and it's called The Duchess. That's a really good movie, especially if you want to get your eyes on this. And the hair actually plays a bit of a role in this movie. It does catch on fire. So spoiler alert, that does happen. Let's move on now to the Regency era. And you will be familiar with this if you've seen Pride and Prejudice. I'm a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice. There is the 1990s version. And then again, there's Keira Knightley, who's in like every English period drama. She seems to have really cornered that market. And she's wonderful in them, so I am not surprised there. Regency era style. Now, if you look, this is a response to the excesses, right, in a way, of Marie Antoinette. We know what happened to her. Again, guillotine, we know about that. Duchess of Devonshire did not die. What happened was the monarchy was overthrown in France. After that era of the late 1800s, there's the French Revolution, and there's a big change. A big change happens with hair. Notably, it really comes down, and powder becomes powder becomes very, very passé and very, very bad taste. To powder your hair, you need wheat. And famously, they did not have enough bread in France. And so, of course, that just made the nobility look so out of touch. So if you had powdered hair, it was just bad and actually maybe dangerous. Really dangerous because, it was considered very anti-revolutionary to be adhering to these old ways. So we're not even really talking about men's hair and stuff like that, but the men's powdered wigs kind of fall out of style and they go for this more Beau Brummel kind of look. And for women, the powder really falls out, and the huge hairdos and the big, big hats in the shape of a ship, all of that is no more. Things become very, very simple. And this is what I was telling you to remember from ancient Greece. Look at the women's hair. This is very evocative and really drew tons of inspiration, the Regency style, and also called the Directoire style, from ancient Greece. The statues and the looks and the hairdos of ancient Greece. And that's why you have these almost sort of severe sculpted curls. And if you look at the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice and you see Elizabeth Bennet's hair there, it to modern eyes looks not great. I remember watching this even in the 90s thinking, I don't know about that hairdo. It's not the best look. Why is everything so stiff looking? To modern eyes, it looks not great. It's completely historically accurate. And in fact, it's the Keira Knightley version of Pride and Prejudice that is not actually accurate, at least not for Keira Knightley. The bangs, the sort of unkept hair, the loose bun of it all. That's a modern hairstyle. That is a modern hairstyle that would look pretty normal today. You might see somebody bopping down the street with that exact hairdo, this afternoon. Let's move along now to the mid-1800s, at least here in what I'm going to call the Western world. This is my least favorite of all the sort of historical hairstyle. You don't know. This happened during the Victorian era. And when people say the Victorian era, sometimes they mistakenly just say the Victorian era and they mean the late 1800s. Her reign was very long, and so you could say Victorian, that means actually anything from really the mid 1800s onwards. The mid 1800s, super ugly hairstyles. I really don't like these. I mean, everybody's, maybe you think that they look nice. I don't. I think they look so severe and kind of bordering on ridiculous, very almost puritanical. Not for me. I love a more romantic look personally. Hey, you know, definitely simpler, definitely toned down lines, at least in the front. Let's move along then to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, which would be the Edwardian era. And we see lots of different hairstyles, lots of elaboration. We do interestingly see some hair that's down as well, even though the updo prevails. You guys know that, right? If you come of age, you're not a little girl anymore. Back then you would wear basically an updo when you would come out. Remember from Pride and Prejudice, the girls, when they're out, always have updos, almost always. And so by the late 1800s, you do see some variation. You do see some hair that's down and half hair down. The half hair down is a little bit more common, and we're seeing curls. They did have curling irons for a long, long time. This is an old tool, and they would heat it up on the fire, or they'd have little sort of hot devices where you could, I think, pop a couple coals in there and keep it hot that way. But they have had curling irons or tongs for the longest time, so that's how they would curl their hair. And they would also, of course, just use paper to pin curl their hair. That's how they did it, and ringlets have been a thing for a long, long time. So by the Edwardian era, women did wear false hair. They would save their own hair, which I know sounds disgusting, but they would brush it out and keep it. And you could use that to make a puffier updo, because the puffy updo was a bit of a thing. Hair pieces have always also been really have been a thing. I just want to let you know that, you know, the idea of extensions and all that is really not new. You could purchase something and it would just come to you like in the mail, or you could purchase it, you know, a hair piece basically to cover up, mostly for the back. That was really common, like a fall of curls or something like that for the back. You would pin it to your hair. If you're ordering it by mail, you had to kind of hope that they got the color right. And many a young lass's day has been ruined by spending a fortune on this helper hair and it not matching her natural hair color at all. That is actually well documented. Okay, so we're at Edwardian. So they used to wear this thing in their hair called a hair rat to get this puffy Gibson girl look. And I also am not a fan. I think maybe my favorite hairstyle was the insane styles of the late 1700s. I don't know. Is it just me? They're just so wild looking and so out there. And I also like bobs, and we're going to get to that in a second. And let's move on now to bobs. Okay, so we think of bobs, we think of flappers. Apparently that's not strictly true. I have found this little tidbit on fashionista.com where they've done some research about the history of the bob. So let's have a look at that. So most people trace the popularity of bobbed hair in Western fashion back to the 1920s, thanks to the haircut's close association with the image of the flapper. However, the cigarette-smoking, flask-wielding flapper of the 1920s didn't exactly start this trend. In 1920, The Times traced the origins of the bob epidemic to 1903, when two female students at Bryn Mawr College appeared with short hair to play basketball. The article also claims that bob hair became popular in Greenwich Village between 1908 and 1912 thanks to the influence of intellectual women, in quotes, from Russia, who used bob hair to disguise themselves from the police. Okay, so apparently it's not strictly invented by the flappers, but we definitely associate the bob with flappers. And so that was 100 years ago, people. So that's just a quick overview of some interesting, you know, and weird fashion hair facts. So that was 100 years ago now. There you have it. Some weird hair history facts. If you want more of these, if you want them from different places, different regions, different eras of history, maybe you want one that's more modern and kind of brings us up from like the 1920s up to date, let me know down below in the comments. Love to hear from you all. And thanks so much for following along with me here in this video. Hope you enjoyed it.